left. Now, as far as Jay Sakai, you know, that book Settlers has been around a long time. It's not a new book. I believe it was published in the 1980s, wasn't it? I mean,
yeah, it was.
Yeah, and you know,
right, yeah, 1980, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I first read that book as a high school student. You know, and I was a high school student during, like, you know, the Bush years, 2004, 2005, and I read that book. And at the time, I loved it. I thought it was great. And why? Because I was living in a small town in Ohio. It was a working class town. Most of the people in my town worked at a factory that made jelly. Some other people worked at a dairy plant that processed milk and dairy products. Other people worked at a company that made like parts of machines that made auto parts, you know, and that this was a very working class town I grew up in. And they had labor unions in the factories. It was the Teamsters Union. I did some job shadowing with the local Teamster organizer at one point as a high school student. These folks were all very, very working class, factory workers, but they all supported the Iraq War, almost all of them, with few exceptions. They supported the Iraq War. If you didn't support the Iraq War, you were a traitor. You needed to move to another country. Islam was an evil religion that needed to be outlawed because they're all terrorists. A lot of evangelical Christianity, wanting to ban gay marriage, and just a lot of right-wing stuff among these people that were factory workers. Well, that was what Lenin called the aristocracy of labor, that these folks, they were living in the first world and they had a high standard of living, right? And because of that, they sympathized with American imperialism, right? Because the imperialists had provided them with a living standard that was way higher than most of the people in the world. And Lenin talked about that very phenomenon in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He says that as the imperialist countries dominate the globe, they buy off a section of the working class. And after World War II, the post-war boom in the United States, that white picket fence and that car, that came with a really right-wing shift among American industrial workers because they were loyal to empire because they were getting a few crumbs from it. That's a real phenomenon. The problem with that book, though, is that book says that reality, that labor aristocracy reality, is permanent, right? Yeah. There can never be a socialist revolution in the United States because there's a big labor aristocracy. Well, anyone who's been paying attention to U.S. politics and U.S. economy for the last 20, 30, 40 years has seen that labor aristocracy has been in decline and decline and decline. You go to the town that I grew up in, those factories are closed. I mean, people have lost their jobs. People are dying from opioids. People have relatives who are in prison. People are hungry. Most of the people in my town have moved to other places in order to work. I live in New York City now. A lot of people have moved to California. I mean, the Midwest, the labor aristocracy of the Midwest is being demolished right now, right? Furthermore, race is a big factor. I mean, the labor aristocracy is white, right? And my town, and like many other towns throughout the Midwest, is more integrated than ever before. There are more Latino students at the high school I went to than there ever were when I was there. There are more students of Indian heritage. There are more Black families so the race aspect, the racism that made the labor aristocracy so right-wing, race was a big deal, right? That's not there either. So this notion that the white working class of the United States, they're this bought-off labor aristocracy, they can never be revolutionary, that was probably true in the 1950s, definitely true in the 1980s. It's not true anymore. Right now, the labor aristocracy is in so much decline that Bernie Sanders, an open socialist, is more popular than ever, right? More popular than ever. Furthermore, among white youth, there's a huge amount of sympathy for Black Lives Matter and opposition to the police state and opposition to the war on drugs. Right now, we're living in a period where this labor aristocracy that stabilized U.S. society and prevented progressive political action is being broken apart, and the potential for solidarity against racism, solidarity against imperialist wars, solidarity against the police state is bigger than ever before. So to be talking about Jay Sakai right now and to just hold that book up is exactly wrong. It is the wrong thing to do in our time. I sympathize with how people might feel, but I feel like in a lot of cases, people who wave around Jay Sakai, it's an excuse to justify their own paralysis. They're frustrated. They're around a lot of very conservative people. They can see through all the anti-communist lies. Other people can't. They're frustrated. They're feeling isolated. They feel like no one understands them. They feel alienated from society. So they can point to that book and say, see, you all are a bunch of rotten Euro settlers, screw you, and they don't have to do the hard work, the very, very hard work of changing people's consciousness. And that's the problem with that book that I would have. It points to a lot of very true things, right? But the true things it points to doesn't add up to what they say it adds up to, right? The world is constantly changing. The world is constantly in motion. And as the world is constantly changing, things that used to be impossible become possible, right? And we are in a period where the revolutionary potential of all the workers in the United States is rising. It's not declining. So now is the wrong time to be screaming about labor aristocracy, in my view.
I do have another question for you about another book. I saw you got the opportunity to meet Alexander Dugin. I have a copy of The Fourth Political Theory, and his analysis on like liberalism is just so great. But I don't talk to many people who like have read this book or even know who he is. And if they know who he is, they're like, oh, you're a Duginist, or you tanky, or like stuff like that, you know. So it's like never anything. What would Dugin have to say about that? About like the potential for a socialist revolution to happen in the United States, because he argues that like communism and fascism are dead, right? And so he's like, we need a fourth way, right? So I'm one because that's one of the videos of yours I watched recently. So I wondered your thoughts on that as well.
Well, Dugin is not a Marxist. He's not a socialist. He's not a communist. And he has actually said in a number of his writings that he has no position on American politics other than he wants, he supports maybe isolationists, right-wing isolationists, because he wants them to leave Russia alone. And, Dugin's political movement in Russia is called the Eurasian movement. And Dugin really believes that there are two forms of civilization in the world. There is Atlanticist civilization, which is from societies that are based, have a lot of access to the ocean. And there is Eurasian civilization, and that's societies that are more landlocked. And he argues that Eurasian civilizations are more collective, and that Atlanticist civilizations are more individualist. There's some truth in that. I mean, it's not entirely correct, but there's some truth in that. Dugin was a communist at one point. He was a founding member of the Russian Communist Party, an associate of Zhuganov, and he wrote the constitution of the Russian Communist Party. Then in the 1990s, he formed something called the National Bolshevik Party, and he eventually dropped out of that. And now he runs something called the Eurasian Movement. He's very much a conservative. He argues that there are some inherent traditional ways, and that especially in Eurasia and in Russia, they have kind of a natural way of being. He draws a lot from Julius Evola. He's right-wing, but he's against Western capitalism. He is a conservative intellectual in Russia. And that book, The Fourth Political Theory, is interesting because it points to a lot of truths, right? I read that book after having gone to Iran, after having gone to Venezuela, and realizing that this was not like Cold War communism, right? That the opposition to American imperialism around the world, in Iran, in Venezuela, other forces, what's rising in China now, it has elements of things we might call left, and it has elements of things that we might call right? The fact that in China right now, there's a huge revival of communism. Mao pictures are everywhere. People are quoting Mao more than they have since like the Cultural Revolution. But at the same time, there's also a huge revival of Confucian thought, right? In the traditional Confucian thought, right? Mao hated Confucius, right? Mao saw Confucius as Chinese feudalism. He, destroyed all the Confucius books. Well, now in modern China, Mao and Confucius walk hand in hand because they're both seen as elements of China's unique identity that makes it separate from the West, right? Confucius is considered right-wing and traditional. Mao is a Marxist revolutionary, but they both have elements of this non-liberalism that kind of defines modern China. And I think that that's what Dugin, he's not even advocating it really. He just points to it in that book. And that's why I learned a lot from that book. And that's why I did praise Dugin when I met with him. I've only met him one time. And honestly, I mean, one of Dugin's main points is he rejects the notion of historical progress. He says that the past, the present, and the future are equal, and that the world is not getting better, it's not getting worse. And that is just entirely wrong in my view. I am a futurist. I believe that humanity is a progressive species that marches forward. I am an optimist. So my worldview is pretty different than Dugin's, but I respect him, right? And I don't think it is accurate to equate Dugin with Adolf Hitler, right? People say, well, they've got a picture of Dugin shaking hands with somebody. Okay, Dugin is Dugin. All right, Dugin, he has his own strand of thought. If people want to know what Dugin thinks, go and read Dugin. I'm not a Duginist. I don't represent Alexander Dugin, and I don't agree with him on a number of points, but I respect him as an intellectual, and I don't think, you'll notice that if you look at any of the like Wikipedia articles about Dugin in the English language, the first sentence will say Dugin is a fascist. But if you read The Fourth Political Theory, he denounces fascism in that book. Very
page one, yeah. Yeah.
I think that my suspicion is that because, he has been an advisor to Putin, he had a TV network in Russia at one point called Tsargrad TV. And I get the idea that American intelligence has decided that Dugin is the worst Russian, right? He's on the sanctions list, and I think that because of that, they have done everything they can to create a stigma around Alexander Dugin, to make it sound like he is the Russian Hitler or something like that. He's not. He's just Dugin, right? He's Dugin. He's a conservative Russian intellectual. He has a lot of influence. He has a lot of people in Russia who listen to him. There's a lot of people in Russia who don't agree with him, right? Well, and he doesn't represent all of the Putin movement. I think there are Putin supporters who like Dugin. There are Putin supporters who vehemently disagree with Dugin. He's an important Russian thinker and intellectual. And I'm not ashamed of the fact that I sat down with him. And I find it to be absurd that they hold up a picture and they say, oh, see, you're a Nazi. I'm not a Nazi, okay? I've spent years as an anti-racist activist, look into my history. I'm very clearly not on the right, but I don't think that Dugin is Satan incarnate. I think he's an important figure. And I had the opportunity to sit down with him at a conference in Moscow in 2018. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
I was really impressed actually because I have a couple friends who live in Russia and Poland, and they really like Dugin, but one of my friends is like a devout Marxist, and the other person I know, the other friend of mine, he's like really into Ebola and stuff like that, and they both have like such different takeaways from what Dugin has to say. And I don't know, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that, because it's a really polarizing topic that I don't get to.
People should think for themselves. I don't like it. The people who will attack me over Dugin are people who heard of Dugin 2 seconds before they attacked me over him as a reason.
Right.
I wish people could think for themselves. I wish people were intellectually curious, right? Mao Zedong, he said, you don't really know what a pear is like until you bit into it. And I think that applies to Dugin as well. Read what Dugin has to say, make a decision for yourself. And that's what I've done. I just gave you my analysis of Dugin. I respect him, but I also don't agree with him. And that's that. That's all there is to it.
Right. And I don't want to spend so much time on this subtler book, but I'm currently still going through the book, but I've come across some issues with it that I've found. There's lots of uncited sources, and other people that have read this book more than once have critiqued it and found really egregious issues with it, like the misquoting of William Z. Foster, which I think is really egregious. But I think this whole trend of like this J. Sakai, like settlers, is like, is like this sacred cow, like it can't be critiqued, otherwise you're you're a chauvinist and a racist if you are, critiquing it. I think it follows this trend that we've been seeing with this synthetic left, very defeatist. It's very negative, and it's all about division, and it's about solidarity. And I think that's why it's such a popular book among the so-called left.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, but it fits kind of that anti-populist worldview, right? All the white working people of the United States are all a bunch of Euro settlers. They're all the enemy. So don't try to organize them. Don't try to win a better life for them.
The third worldist type type deal.
Yeah, and
and no one's seen this guy. Like there's no picture of him anywhere. It's like so weird. It's so weird. It's like these people are like the people that are really like stuck on the book and just really just praise it are. I'm just like, it's just so odd to me that this guy has like never. It's like he's maybe done one or two interviews that are all audio. I've never seen a picture of him. I think it's very strange. This guy just comes out of nowhere, has this book, and everyone, it's like, it's all over the place, and no one's seen him.
Yeah, how did it even resurface? Like, I had never even heard of
it until like.
And now I can't like go any of my like lefty groups on Facebook. It's in every group now. Like, how did that happen?
When I first heard of it, it was at the time I was in Ohio. I was working with some prisoners in Ohio. There were a group of prisoners who were involved in the Lucasville prison uprising in 1993, and they were, some of them were facing the death penalty and all of that. And I was involved in the Lucasville Prisoner Support Committee, and I would visit prisoners and go to their court dates and such. And a lot of them had a newspaper from an obscure, very mysterious communist group called the Maoist Internationalist Movement, MIM. And it was a newspaper, it was called MIM Notes, and it was a strange newspaper. And a lot of prisoners told me that they were very suspicious of this newspaper that would start showing up. If prisoners were known to be communists, they would start getting MIM Notes, sent to them in the mail. And they would have no idea who was sending. And it was this very mysterious paper that was sent mainly to Black prisoners in Ohio and throughout the country. If you were getting, Workers' World or the Revolution newspaper, or Revolutionary Worker, you would also start to get this newspaper called MIM Notes. It was very mysterious, and it was a communist group that was very, very shadowy and shady, and no one really knows who they were. But they pushed that book, and that if you were a prisoner and you would send them a letter to their P.O. box, they would send you a photocopied edition of Settlers in the mail. And prisoners showed it to me. They had this book, Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat, and it was like a spiral-bound photocopied edition of the book that they had in the prisons. It was very mysterious, very, very mysterious. I do know that it was revealed that the leader of this MIM group was a guy named Henry Park, who had lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan for a while and had gone to China a few times and died. And there was an obituary when he died. He was a Korean American. He'd been friendly to the RCP, and he claimed that they had accused him of rape or something like that. And it's the more you look into that rabbit hole, the whole thing is just really, really, really weird. But that's kind of how American leftism is. It's all.
RCP.
What's that?
The Revolutionary Communist Party with the Avakian people, right? That's
Henry Park wrote a statement before his death, dissolving his organization called the Maoist Internationalist Movement. And in his statement, he claimed that the reason he was dissolving the group was that the Revolutionary Communist Party was accusing him of rape from decades ago, and that it wasn't true. And that was bizarre, because if you ask anyone from the RCP, they don't know anything about this. The whole thing is really strange. And, we do know there was this individual, this Korean American man, Henry Park, and he had been at Harvard, and he'd had an organization called Radicads, which stood for Radical Academics. And they organized trips to China during the Gang of Four period. And they were kind of around the RCP and had a falling out. And he apparently was the individual who put out this mysterious newspaper. And he was the one who really popularized Jay Sakai's book, Settlers. And he made it like his mission to popularize that book on the internet. And he had the third worldist line that white workers are inherently reactionary. It was a very strange grouping. And they apparently dissolved. I mean, it was around like the early 2000s, they were still doing stuff. And, occasionally I would be at a university and I would see a stack of their newspapers, MIM Notes newspapers someplace. But who knows who they were, right? And I mean, you never know with any of this stuff, right? I mean, you never really know with any of it, right? When we know that the government, it's been proven that there have been instances where the government set up fake communist organizations, but we also know that the government also infiltrates actual communist groups and pushes them to do different things. And the United States during the Cold War was the homeland of anti-communism, right? This was the home of the free world. So, the U.S. government goes all over the world preventing communist revolutions. So you think anyone here talking about a communist revolution, they are going to be right on top of you, So, the left has been, and this is kind of an example of why things are so weird. Leftism in the United States has been so manipulated, right? And there have been so many covert efforts to maneuver and all of that. There's actually a very good book written by a British intelligence officer named Frank Kitson. And he wrote a memoir. It's called Gangs and Countergames. Oh. And it was about how Kenya, during the Mau Mau uprising, when the Land and Freedom Army was formed in the 1950s in Kenya, right? The people of Kenya were fighting for their freedom. So the British intelligence, they realized they had a little bit of a problem, because to fight the Mau Mau, all the British soldiers were white, right? And the Kenyans were black. And so it was a bit of a problem. They would go into an area to fight the Mau Mau, and all the black people would support the Mau Mau. So they got the idea to, get some black people and say, okay, well, you're now the Kenyan Liberation Army. And, and you hate the British, you hate the British Empire, but you really hate those Mau Mau, don't you? Right? Those Mau Mau are like the phonies, and you're going to go wage a war against the Mau Mau for not being true anti-British revolutionaries. And it worked, right? It was part of the way the British were able to do it. And they set up what they called a counter gang, right? And this is a tactic used in low-intensity warfare. Actually, William S. Lind, who was a Pentagon advisor, he wrote, he talks about fourth generation warfare, and he makes similar arguments. He talks about how in Northern Ireland, the British realized that the British government fighting the IRA wasn't so great. So they started arming Protestant groups like the Orange Order and Ulster separatists to fight them, right? And that having, the Ulster Unionists, they could murder somebody extrajudicially, and that wasn't a war crime, right? Because it's a terrorist group killing another terrorist group, right? And that by setting up a counter gang, that can be an effective way to fight. And these are the kind of tactics that are used in insurgencies, in low intensity warfare, and in counterintelligence operations. And I mean, for example, the Spartacist League just dissolved, right? This was a communist group that was around. They're no longer around. They've officially dissolved, right? So I can talk shit about them because they don't exist anymore. During the 1980s, the Workers' World Party had a very effective demonstration called the People's Anti-War Mobilization, where they organized 100,000 people to march to the Pentagon against Ronald Reagan, in 1981. The Spartacist League mobilized their members to attack that march with baseball bats. And the justification that they gave was the march called for peace in Nicaragua, peace in El Salvador. And so they said, by calling for peace, this is a march against the armed communist guerrilla insurgencies in those countries. That was a lie, right? The march was an anti-imperialist march, but they told their members, there's a peace march on Washington led by the Workers' World Party. That means they don't support the armed communist guerrillas of Nicaragua and all of that. So they got their members, and they showed up in leather jackets with baseball bats, and they charged the People's Anti-War Mobilization and injured a lot of people, right? Now, what was going on there? Well, what inspires some weird Trotskyist group to take up weapons against a big communist-led anti-war rally? Who knows, right? Now, what's also interesting is the Moonies, the Unification Church, prior to that, went through Washington, D.C., ripping down all the posters, right? And that it appears that because the People's Anti-War Mobilization was a pro-Soviet, pro-China, anti-imperialist rally that got hundreds of thousands of people to attend it as a march against Reagan and the war drive, it appears that U.S. intelligence mobilized their allies to disrupt it in some ways. And you had the Moonies that are long time known to be CIA assets. They went after it, and it appears the Spartacist League was probably infiltrated, and they targeted it with violence as well. And this kind of thing happens. And that's why stuff like MIM, stuff like that, you don't want to snitch jacket. You never want to point at anyone and say, you're a provocateur and you're an informer. And that's not the point. The point isn't, are you working for the government or not? The point is what you're doing helping the working class struggle or not? That's the point. And Jay Sakai, not helping, right? Spartacists attacking the People's Anti-War Mobilization with baseball bats, not helping. When you see people that are kind of not helping, that's what needs to be called out, right? What their motivation is, who might be manipulating them in order to do it, that's a whole nother conversation. And if you spend too much time thinking about that, you're going to lose your mind and become paranoid, right? It's
suspicious of everybody. Yeah. A lot of what you're saying reminds me a lot of the stuff I see happening like in the Middle East, with like all these terrorist groups getting U.S. weapons somehow. You have to really wonder how they're getting, you know, Saudi Arabia funneling all these terror groups weapons that we give them. You know, it's
Yeah, well, in Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, the Grand Chessboard, which is about how to dominate Eurasia, he said that the goal is to, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other, and that is the goal for maintaining U.S. hegemony. Keep the barbarians killing each other. Yeah,
that's disgusting.
yeah.
What was
I mean,
that?
it's called the Grand Chessboard. The Iraq War, the Iraq-Iran War, was a great example of two anti-imperialist states, right? Ba'athist Arab socialism in Iraq, Islamic Revolutionary, the Islamic Republic in Iran, killing each other, right? And the USA gave covert support to both sides. It gave weapons to Iran at some points, and it gave weapons to Iraq at some points. And at least 1 million people died as two anti-imperialist forces were manipulated against each other. And I think that, you know, I mean, that's a tactic that can be used. And that this is the late Cold War. See, when the Cold War started, it was American imperialism versus the communists. And that tended to strengthen the communists, right? But Brzezinski's whole thing is let's manipulate communists against each other, right? Let's have the USA look like it's retreating and then just incite the communists to kill each other. And that's how the Cold War was won, really, for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The Sino-Soviet split, the Euro-communist divide, where the communists of Europe turned against the Soviet Union, you know, all throughout the 1980s, all kinds of Eastern European governments turning their backs on the Soviets and then getting in debt to American banks. This was all a strategy for how to defeat communism and how to defeat the Soviet Union by playing communists against each other.